for Dr. Devra Davis. There's been a lot of work, Devra, on sperm, which is relatively easy to measure. Are there any really good studies looking at the effect on egg cells in females, humans and or animals?
As you know, in vitro studies have been done in animals, and we do have some studies on oocyte formation, the very formation of eggs. There's also a variety of studies on pregnancy outcomes, which clearly show that exposure in the first trimester of pregnancy for the rodent produces offspring with smaller brains, smaller testes, more damage to the hippocampus and the cerebellum. So there's actually quite a lot of work on prenatal effects. In whole animals, there are studies done at Yale University by Professor Hugh Taylor, where they looked at behavioral impacts and basically confirmed everything Henry has just showed you. Namely, what they showed is that prenatally exposed rodents produce offspring that have significant problems with learning and behavior, and they actually had a scale for measuring ADHD, adult learning disabilities, and showed a clear increase in problems. And Henry will be interested to know they showed that the animals responded faster but made more mistakes. Perfectly consistent with the work that he did so many years ago.
Okay, thank you. Henry, did you want to add something to that, or you're good?
Well, regarding eggs, there are a series of studies on houseflies by the Greek investigator.
Okay.
So you may want to look at those results.
Okay, thank you.
Is eggs.
Now, you mentioned how radio frequency radiation can impair cognitive function. Can you comment on pilots who are in the cockpit and are surrounded by electromagnetic fields? They're exposed to radar. There's been some evidence in the news that some of them might be reacting to this in the sense that they're making more mistakes as pilots. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, there's some study on fighter pilots. I think they're exposed to a lot of radar radiation, and their report of confusion after they fly on the fighters.
I'm going to go back to you, Dr. Davis. We have seat warmers in a lot of modern cars these days, and anything that is wire that heats up is going to produce a magnetic field. It won't be radio frequency, but it'll be extremely low frequency. Is there any evidence that this could be associated with colorectal cancers and other prostate issues, for example?
As you know, that's an excellent question, and I wish I had the answer. As you know, magnetic fields are very important. If there's no question that you will have a substantial magnetic field, I would urge anyone that uses a seat warmer to use it for a very short period of time and turn it off as soon as possible, and try to avoid using it, except, of course, in the Canadian environment, that may be a bit more challenging.
Right. Now, we also have motorcycles. I had a student once who did some research. He was on he rode a motorcycle to class. He told me he was a grandfather, so he wasn't concerned about reproducing anymore. But motorcycles also have very high levels, right? We're at the seat level. And this could be a problem for some people as well.
Excellent point.
And what about erectile dysfunction? I know that that could probably get some of our male viewers kind of interested. Are there any studies looking at erectile dysfunction with RF exposure?
Well, as I showed in my slide, there clearly are some studies on this, but Dr. Havis, the question is really backwards. Do we really need to prove that people are getting erectile dysfunction from their exposures, or shouldn't we seek to prevent exposure and reduce exposure because we know that there is in fact a likely connection there? And I think that we have to, as Fiorella Belpoggi said, we don't want to go through what we went through with asbestos and lead and tobacco. And Bill Ray told me and several others that tobacco is the thing we have to think about here, that cell phone and radio frequency radiation is the tobacco of our generation. I think there's very little question of that.
There's also some evidence that people who live near cell phone towers, for example, over time will have lower levels of testosterone. And so that would potentially affect erectile dysfunction as well.
That's an excellent point. The Indians are among the few that have actually done studies where they've looked at biochemical markers of things that are indications of inflammation, and biochemical markers that predict cancer risk and neurodegenerative damage, as well as effects on reproduction. And they have shown a reduction in testosterone, propionate, and other indications in those who live closest to cell towers. And these studies, I should say, in India are controlled. They're not just incidental, observational, but they actually look at people who live within 100 meters of the cell tower compared to those who live 300 meters and more away. And they find a statistically significant increase in biochemical markers of damage in their blood.
Thank you. Henry, I know you didn't talk about 5G, but one of the things we're told about 5G and the millimeter wave component of it is that millimeter waves don't penetrate very deeply into the body, but could they have an effect on the peripheral nervous system that's right embedded in the skin?
That's entirely possible. Yeah, so there would be stimulation of peripheral nerve, and then we have a feedback going back to the central nervous system and cause all kinds of neurological effects.
We've worked
at all.
Right. We've worked with Professor Paul Ben-Ishai at Ariel University in Israel, and he has produced a very important paper that goes through how and why the skin is our largest immunological organ, and how it's plausible that even though the exposure is superficial, that the effects are systemic. And if you think as an example, when babies are born with hyperbilirubinemia, jaundice, we treat them by exposing them under the light. We protect their eyes, but we expose them to blue light because blue light is biologically very active. So we want to protect the eye, but by exposing the skin, the surface of the skin of a newborn, which is very, very thin, you can, in fact, promote the creation in the liver of dihydroxyvitamin D. So the synthesis of vitamin D through the liver is guided by the skin exposure of the newborn. And it's a very powerful indication of skin exposure and how biologically important it is. Joshua Rosenthal is a physician now back in New York who's worked with us, and we have excellent materials that he has generated, and he has a whole set of materials on this. I'm reminded that Cindy Russell's website and ours also has material on this and on damage to the ovaries from radiofrequency radiation.